afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 8th and last session of the EPDP Lecture Series featuring the private sector. For the benefit of first-time attendees, the EPDP organized this lecture series to gather energy experts and practitioners from government, the academe, and the private sector, and provide them with a neutral platform to exchange ideas and insights on the sector. This lecture series also supports the short-term and long-term capacity building programs of EPDP as it aims to provide a holistic understanding of the country's electric power industry. After hosting lectures from representatives of the government and academe, the EPDP now aims to provide perspectives from the private sector. Our lecture this afternoon is entitled Cheap Electricity for a First World Philippines, the 24/7 Solar Storage Revolution, to be presented by Mr. Leandro Leviste. Mr. Leviste is the founder and CEO of Solar Philippines. Last year, Solar Philippines introduced the lowest electricity cost in Philippine history and the lowest cost of solar in Southeast Asia at 2.99 pesos per kilowatt hour. This year, they are constructing 500 megawatt projects and developing a multi-gigawatt solar storage pipeline to make the Philippines a leader in the global solar transition. Mr. Leviste has an international baccalaureate diploma from the International School Manila and a bachelor's degree in political science from Yale University. The lecture will run for 40 minutes and will be followed by a 20-minute open forum, where questions from the audience will be entertained. Kindly note that the presentation content and opinions of the lecturer do not necessarily reflect that of EPDP, USAID, and the UPCON Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us all welcome Mr. Leandro Leviste.
Good afternoon, everyone. I must begin by making a few caveats and a few opening remarks. The first is great thanks to EPDP and the UP School of Economics for organizing this wonderful program. I watched some of the videos of the previous lectures prior to this, learned quite a lot, but also learned to be quite careful what to say, knowing that this will soon be recorded and posted online. The other thing is that it's really humbling to be here in the presence of so many esteemed members of the power industry, many of whom had once been, in fact, the chief policymakers in the DOE, like former DOE Secretary Monsada, as well as the current man in whose hands is the fate of the entire Philippine energy mix, Meralco Energy Sourcing Head, Mr. Rolly Cagampan. You know, this man is really the unsung hero of low electricity prices in the Philippines. And if you want to know the history for why electricity is the most expensive in the Philippines, in all of Asia, you ask Rolly.
I'll give you the fourth leg.
Okay. So, considering that this is a public forum, I will admittedly be a bit reserved as to what remarks I will make on the record, but will be happy to say more off the record. And I will also apologize in advance that the PowerPoint presentation is not as fully developed and polished as it could have been, but hope that I can spend less time in this initial presentation and allow more time for questions. Lastly, I will disclose our ulterior motive for being here today. Our company has very big plans, and in executing those, really has one key ingredient, and that is to recruit the best and brightest minds in the Philippines. And so we are here where they may be, at the UP School of Economics, or so I am told. So anybody who is passionate about lowering the cost of electricity and doing more than just trying to enrich or grow a purely profit-oriented corporation is very much welcome to consider working with us, because hindi na ho uso ang pumasok sa public sector or sa academe para tumulong sa bayan. Ang uso na ngayon, mula nung pagpasok ni Elon Musk, ay pumasok sa private sector. Kasi through entrepreneurship, through the introduction of new technologies at accelerated timeframes, we can do far more than previous generations had once thought was imaginable as far as improving the state of the Philippines. So I'm gonna just play a brief audiovisual presentation. So for lack of any audio on this laptop, I'll just give some annotations to this. Our company's mission is to lower the cost of electricity in the Philippines. And while mission and vision and core values might be very boilerplate for companies in this power industry, it's really worth asking how sincere companies may be in professing those values when the facts of where we are as a country speak for themselves. We have the most expensive cost of electricity in Asia, and that is not simply because of a lack of subsidies, but also because the true cost of generation is higher here than in other countries. And we believe that for the same reason that Filipinos are increasingly resorting to radical solutions, like electing a mayor from Mindanao to be the newest president of the Philippines, so it is time for a radical change in the Philippine power sector. The past forms of technology have failed us. The past policy proposals and stakeholders have also proven ineffective. But we're hopeful that with very low-cost solar power, the Filipino finally has a solution. And we've achieved this by vertically integrating. No longer importing solar panels from China, no longer contracting EPCs from Germany, and no longer paying middlemen who buy land, get permits, and get contracts, and therefore ask for a development premium, cutting out all this fat in the supply chain of the Philippines to achieve the lowest upfront cost in the entire Southeast Asia solar industry, to have the lowest cost power in the history of the Philippines and cheapest solar electricity price in partnership with Meralco at 2 pesos 99 centavos per kilowatt hour. In fact, there's a new CSP at 2 pesos 98. By next year, it will not be a surprise, it will be 1.99. All to the benefit of Meralco consumers. And this is all in light of various other momentous changes around the world, where, for instance, solar is now pricing at 1 peso per kilowatt hour in so many other countries, such as in Saudi Arabia, where there was recently concluded a tender where the lowest price was actually around 80 centavos per kilowatt hour, or in Mexico, where there was a wind that came in at below 1 peso and a solar that came in at around 1 peso. None of this is subsidized. None of this is environmentally driven. All of it is economically driven. Because of the low upfront cost, that is also a factor here. And despite high interest rates, so in India, they have 10.5%, 11% interest rates. They might have lower land costs and higher sun, but because of that high interest rate, they actually have a higher cost of production. And yet their solar benchmark price there is now 2 to 2.5 pesos per kilowatt hour. For many years, many power companies had said that we could not see the same prices in the Philippines. For the same reason why many maintain that Filipinos must continue to put up with very expensive electricity as if they have no alternative. And that's why we see it as our moral obligation to bring this really cheap electricity, which is the result of things that are happening in other markets, to the Philippines as well. So this is very much a reality in our context. And policymakers around the world are increasingly recalibrating their energy mix policies, canceling many coal plants. So between China and India, more than 100,000 megawatts of coal plants have been cancelled in the last 2 years. Many of the sites that were supposed to be thermal plants are now being converted to solar farms because at least that same interconnection, like many of the interconnections of the 7 Meralco coal plants that are currently up for regulatory approval, could instead be used for solar farms at a lower cost for consumers and a higher return on investment for the shareholders. And that all of this is happening even with storage at a far faster pace than people had expected. So as for what we're doing in the Philippines to try and accelerate this, of course, well within the limited means of our company, we've set up a factory that is now exporting solar panels as an OEM subcontractor for Tier 1 Chinese manufacturers to the US and Europe. Other countries are soon also going to be implementing tariffs against Chinese panels, making it advantageous for these Chinese manufacturers to find alternative places where they can source their labor for assembling these panels. And the Philippines has proven to be quite competitive in this respect, also because of the productivity of our workforce and the predominantly sun-power trained staff that we have in our factory, after this US manufacturer had shut down 30 factories in the Philippines in the last 2 years. Our company is also the contractor, as I mentioned, in our own projects, is also the developer, cutting out all these things in the value chain. So the problem in the Philippines is that the ERC basically allows people to pass on whatever cost to consumers is negotiated with the utility before, and now as the result of the CSP, provided that it's at a reasonable rate of return based on the cost, but doesn't really give people an incentive to lower their actual cost. So retail competition and open access destroys the paradigm and allows real low-cost producers to grab more market share to offset their lower rates of return on that smaller piece of their investment. So that if we can only change these incentives to have people contract at very high prices because there's no benefit to having very low upfront costs, then we can have much lower costs for electricity to consumers. But the basic point here is that don't believe what any power generator in the Philippines will tell you is the inevitable upfront cost of their power plant. Necessity is the mother of invention. If suddenly we change our paradigm and say, we're not going to let you pass through whatever cost to consumers, we won't even let you pass fuel costs to consumers. Our COA contracts are now fixed price without the fuel pass-through. Then people will find ways to be competitive instead of trying to make these super normal profits out of their power investments. And we inaugurated this factory last year with President Duterte in this picture over here. We signed a power supply agreement with Meralco in September of 2016, and again for another one in October of 2017. Mr. Kagampar, I believe, is the handsome gentleman in this photo over here. And we've had various other rooftop projects that we've opened along the way. But as for the main purpose of this session, maybe it's important to give some more meat as to how this transition into a predominantly solar energy mix could happen. So the logical thing is to displace the most expensive energy sources first, and the least expensive last. And incidentally, the most expensive ones, gas and diesel, are those which run as a peaking and mid-merit most economically, and the least expensive, as like coal, which run as base load, also align with when the cost of generating for solar is lowest, and conversely when it is highest. So it just makes perfect sense to displace gas and diesel before displacing coal. So the limiting factor is actually how many plants we can construct and how fast all of this can be rolled out in the context of our current regulatory and bureaucratic environment. But as far as the economics, one can say that before any of these plants actually come online, solar with storage is already the least cost form of generation. So as mentioned, if you're displacing the more expensive stuff first, then solar head-to-head beats that more expensive stuff. And the least expensive stuff last. Solar head-to-head by that date will also be cheaper than the most expensive stuff. If you sign a contract for a coal plant 5 years before its COD, the same, if done for a solar plant with batteries, would be able to result in lower effective rates to consumers. With some more details as to the battery prices required for that to happen in the next slide. So I guess that sequence for contracting is quite important. So if we spend the next 3 years, for example, making sure that not a single diesel generator or gas plant will ever run, other than in emergency situations, ever again in this country's history, then by the time we're done with that, then we can start replacing some of the more expensive coal plants, such as certain ones in the Visayas, in Mindanao, which are currently running at an effective rate of 7 to 8 pesos per kilowatt hour, depending on the prevailing fuel price. Again, the most expensive coal plants in the Philippines are as high as 8 pesos per kilowatt hour as an effective rate to consumers. Solar and storage is cheaper than that even today. And by the COD of many of these planned coal plants in Luzon, such as those with a published rate of 370 something, but with a true rate of 5 pesos, and with, depending on the prevailing Newcastle price, as high as 6 pesos, when you count all the other transmission and line rental and other costs that these would have, which solar would not, then by the COD, let's say by 2022, 3 or 4, solar with storage will also be cheaper. So I guess to provide some specific numbers to that, it is now publicly known that the cost of solar energy without storage can be as low as 2 pesos 98 per kilowatt hour. And the cost of adding storage today, with the upfront cost of around $250 per kilowatt hour, will result in different effective costs per kilowatt hour if you're going to be using that for baseload or for only peaking and mid-merit. If you're only going to firm your daytime supply, then you're going to only need less than 1 hour of storage for every 1 megawatt of rated capacity. So if you have, for example, an upfront solar project cost of $1 million per megawatt, and your storage cost is an installed $300,000 per megawatt, then you've got a 1.3 solar with storage cost. But if your ratio of solar to storage becomes 2 hours to 1 megawatt, then you'll need to have a 1.6. If it's going to be 3 hours to 1 megawatt, then a 1.9. So you can see, depending on your application, you'll have a higher upfront cost or lower one. So let's go with the lower application first, by making sure that not a single gas plant or diesel plant will run, other than in an emergency situation, ever again in the history of the Philippines. And the question then is, when will solar and storage be cheaper with, let's say, a ratio of 2 hours to 1 megawatt than an assumed effective price of coal of, let's say, 5 to 5.5 pesos per kilowatt hour? At a storage cost of $150 per kilowatt hour, any financial model will put it in plain terms: solar with storage is cheaper than coal. So the only question that must be asked is, when will we be at $150 per kilowatt hour or less? So that's half of the storage cost where we are today. Tesla has publicly stated that their target at the cell level by 2020 is $100, if not less. And at a pack level would presumably be at around 150. So according to that more aggressive forecast, we should be there as early as in 2020. It will be very conservative to say that we will be there by 2022 to 2023, the supposed commercial operations date for many of the new plants that will be coming online. That would require many years into their 20-year power supply agreements to recover their investments. And if retail competition open access is implemented even just a few years into the effectivity of those PSAs, all of these discussions on these PSAs will be irrelevant. Those plants will need to compete with very cheap solar on the retail competition open access markets, and therefore be stranded, unless they will just be needing to run at their marginal cost because the investments have already been made, in which case we will have some very, very unhappy coal and gas investors. And the risk is larger for gas because you have a higher marginal cost. So it's going to be far earlier when solar is going to be cheaper than your marginal cost. So I'm calling it now. Any uncontracted gas plant is going to be a stranded asset as soon as enough people can build these solar plants online. Every single gas plant in the Philippines that is uncontracted will be a stranded asset. And that will happen for coal 5 years after that for gas. So this is all with a response to the question of when can we theoretically reach a predominantly solar storage energy mix in the Philippines? The answer to that being that, economically, it can happen as soon as we can roll out these plants, which would be before the commercial operation states of many of these coal plants. The other question being the availability of land and interconnection. And I'll say a bit about that after this. But if that more difficult burden of proof cannot be met, at the very least, the response to the question of when can we at least have a significant share of our energy mix, not necessarily 50 to 80%, but even 20 to 30%, in which gas and diesel will be largely shut out, when will this happen? I don't think anybody can make an economic case for that not being an inevitable outcome within the next few years as soon as these plants can come online. And the only defense that they would have would be a contract that would not be carved down under open access, where Meralco consumers and utility consumers will be subsidizing the profits of very, very well-off corporations. But as for the question on feasibility and execution, the Philippines is actually quite a small solar market in the global context. So there's 100,000 megawatts of solar that was installed last year. They're looking at 120,000 this year, and a CAGR of 20% of growth compounded every year thereafter that. And the Philippines only installed 500 megawatts or 600 megawatts at its peak during the feed-in tariff, and barely anything last year. So in terms of supply, there's no issue whatsoever. The issue would possibly be on land and interconnection. Now with interconnection, as long as the grid operators and the utilities, to the extent that some of these plants can be embedded, cooperate with what is already economically beneficial, then interconnection is something that really should be within one's control. And to the extent that the sufficient interconnection does not exist today, that is only a short-term issue because it can be added in the next few years. But the more relevant concern, I believe, that others may raise is on the availability of land. So our company would hopefully be one data point, and hopefully others would also be another data point, that we have 5,000 hectares of land that we are consolidating, that will be for projects that can come online in the next few years. And believe that the island of Luzon, just between areas within a 10-kilometer radius of existing interconnection points that are unproductive agricultural lands, has between 30 to 50,000 hectares of immediately available solar land. And it's always ultimately a question of economics. So if the solar cost is low enough, then the project's economics can afford a higher land and civil works cost. Then you could increasingly be using rougher terrain. In Japan, they're even using mountains and other unforgiving areas to accommodate more of the solar. So land is not going to be an issue in terms of the influx of solar in the Philippine grid, which is also an issue when we consider that if there's no limit to the supply of solar, then perhaps long-term wholesale prices will be depressed because anybody that can make money out of building a commercial solar plant will do so. So perhaps it would be a good idea for customers to think twice before contracting so much of their capacity rather than benefiting from very low solar prices and Western prices in the next few years. So I'd like to highlight a near-term challenge that we have as a society in terms of achieving a lower cost electricity. Because our COA is really going to be the holy grail. Once that is in effect, I'm convinced Western prices are not going to go back to their historical norms, because before some of the current supply goes offline, which people would think would increase the prevailing market price, a lot of this new supply from new technologies will come online, keeping prices close to where they currently are. So long-term price of electricity in the Philippines will be close to what it is today. But all of this is to naught, because currently, if you're a contestable customer, any of the retail electricity suppliers in this room would be glad to offer you power at 3.5 pesos per kilowatt hour for your 24-hour requirement. Some going as low as 3 pesos per kilowatt hour, depending on the assumptions. But the average cost of generation passed on to captive customers in the Philippines is between 4.5 to 5 pesos per kilowatt hour. It's ridiculous that in some parts of the Visayas, where there's a huge oversupply, and Western prices are now at 2 pesos on average per kilowatt hour, are the very same places where customers are paying 6 peso generation rates because of old PSAs that have yet to be carved down. But that's past. The bigger problem is that new contracts are being signed and CSPs being authorized until today. So I've posted some of them anonymously over here. I'm not going to single out which utilities these are from, but it's from 3 different samples. The first one is an ongoing CSP for a 6 megawatt, 2 times 3 bunker plant made in a G7 country. So you can't use any technology other than a bunker engine, and it has to be from one of 7 countries. So if it's from Malaysia or Thailand, they will not accept it. It has to be from, say, Japan. Another one over here is for a 10 megawatt bunker plant in a 2 times 5 configuration that has to come from Europe. So if you're using Caterpillar, or if you're using any other well-known American or Japanese diesel engine brand, you cannot participate for this electrical requirements. And the DOE's policy on CSP is avowedly against any process that favors a technology or a supplier. I believe they no longer even allow for Swiss challenges. It has to be all an open bid. And we're hopeful that these 2 ongoing electric co-op CSPs that will pass through, given especially current fuel prices due to the train bill, effective prices of 12 to 14 pesos per kilowatt hour to provincial customers, that these will hopefully not push through. But there's another example here of a certain utility in Metro Manila that has published an offer for 414 megawatts of gas. And it was initially published actually on, I believe, December 19, 2017, where you had to submit your pre-qualification documents by January 3. And you have to be able to start supplying the power on January 26 for a 414 megawatt capacity. So obviously you can't build a gas plant in 1 month. So you have to be an existing gas plant. The question then is, how many 414 megawatt or natural gas plants are there in the Philippines? To the extent that there is none other than one, which happened to be the original proponent, this is indeed not, as the name suggests, a competitive selection process. But let's give the auctioneer the benefit of the doubt. I'm sure that they were just trying to do what was best to ensure that there are no brownouts in the Philippines. And maybe they did not consider that they could buy the power from this same plant that's currently dispatching to the WESM at a much lower price than what they contracted. So hopefully, they've learned the error of their ways and will soon heed the pronouncements of policymakers that this kind of thing just is unacceptable. So, as long as all CSPs are on an open basis, no Swiss challenge, no exclusion of other technologies, provided that they can meet the needed requirements of the supply, then we should see much, much lower prices for electricity very soon. And just to give some more color to that last example, in a recent pre-bid conference for that 414 gas capacity, there were 2 existing coal plants that had showed up and asked, can we offer a lower rate than this gas plant? No question as to the viability of supply from these 2 coal plants. But apparently, not even other coal plants can participate in this CSP. So you have to be an existing gas plant. So I understand that the DOE has recently released a circular just in time to prevent the CSP from pushing through. If it pushes through, then there would be quite a significant regulatory problem. So we're hopeful that consumers in Metro Manila will be spared from this overpriced power. So, what are the solutions to lower electricity prices in our opinion? The first, as anyone else would say, would be the immediate implementation as far as one can, to the household level if possible, of retail competition open access, which I understand the previous lecturers have gone into much depth. But I think others have been more reserved as to the benefit to consumers of doing this. Again, it's one of the greatest underappreciated facts that any contestable customer in the Philippines is availing of sub-4, close to 3 peso per kilowatt hour rates for new contracts today. At least 30, if not 50% lower than what some captive customers are being forced to pay generation companies. So this alone will save the Filipino 200 billion pesos per year, which, if you just wanted to tax it and give it to the poor, would be the equivalent of 1,000 pesos per Filipino family per month. The CSP law is currently also being discussed in Congress, and if approved, would mean that utilities will no longer be allowed to set their own terms for their power procurement. There will be a third-party auctioneer that will ensure the impartiality and objectivity of this process, and also ensure that affiliates of the companies that may own these utilities will not be given an undue advantage. And next would be the implementation of rules either at the DOE, ERC, or legislative level that will allow for microgrids and distributed energy resources. Currently, some utilities argue that it is illegal to install a solar installation on your rooftop financed by a third party, because that is a violation of the franchise of that utility. The argument contrary to that is that this is not a form of distribution, it is a form of generation or distributed generation that has not been contemplated in the old paradigms of the EPIRA. But to the extent that many corporations are very conservative, and the extent that many of these utilities are in fact encouraging this view, then the uptake of commercial rooftop installations financed by third parties in the Philippines is being very much slowed. And even if they are made acceptable, if they would have to be regulated by the ERC, if you have to get a COC, we're now introducing solar at zero upfront to homes. And if you're saying that anybody in this room that wants to get a financed solar installation on its rooftop is going to have to go to the ERC to get a certificate of compliance for a 1 kilowatt installation, that degree of red tape is going to kill the uptake of distributed generation in the Philippines, which might very well be the intention of some of the opponents of more of this liberalization, but which is why I think it's important that more people are made aware of these anti-competitive interpretations of the law. And the RE law also has underappreciated provision called the green energy option, which, according to the bill, says that end users may directly contract from RE facilities their energy requirements. But the current draft rules, last that we checked, provided that customers would have to go through their respective distribution utility, provided that the blended generation charge shall not be increased as a result. So rather than making it an option for people to contract with any other generator, they're effectively making it an opt-in, opt-out among options still provided to you by your utility. And that if the effective rate goes down for a customer, they will have to split the savings with a customer who wouldn't opt in because of legacy contracts from more expensive coal, gas, and other plants. So, whereas there might be a disproportionate amount of attention devoted to how renewable energy had previously been subsidized in the Philippines, which, by the way, is now completely unnecessary for any new build. The current proposal for the green energy option is for RE consumers to subsidize the lost profits of existing fossil fuel operators. Hopefully, that will not see itself in the final drafting of that rule. But lastly, I think the surefire way that we can state that Filipinos will soon have access to at least 30% cheaper electricity is that even if utilities and regulators will not catch up with the rate of technological improvement, and if the gap of actual solar installation so much trails the potential installation, and the difference between a solar cost and a grid cost grows because the grid operators and utilities will not benefit from the lower solar cost by contracting more solar every year. The consequence will be that consumers will just be more incentivized to install solar on their rooftops or form their own microgrid installations to save on the expensive fossil-powered utility cost. So, from the perspective of a utility, it is in your interest to contract at the least cost, to embrace this very cheap technology, because consumers have another way of availing of it. No longer do they have to simply make appeals to your altruism, because if you don't improve your service, you will go out of business. One comforting thought is that they will still need utilities because they will not be able to be independent from the grid due to the cost ineffectiveness or due to the need to have outsized batteries to be truly off-grid. However, given current cost trajectories and the possibility of linking various customers together and new forms of storage technology such as liquid and hydrogen storage that would allow people to store power over several days, if not seasons, we believe that there will be enough ways for people to go fully off-grid. So massive grid defection is going to happen in the Philippines, just as it is happening in countries like Australia today. So, before going into the top part of this slide, I'll go into the middle part. Just to take this opportunity also to offer anybody here solar at zero upfront. If you're currently paying Meralco 10 pesos per kilowatt hour on your monthly bill, you can buy it from us at a 30% discount without having to have any money out. So with those economics, hopefully, it's going to be a matter of time only before every Meralco customer is going to install solar on their rooftops, unless Meralco contracts more solar at $2.99, in which case the captive customers will also have a lower price. So that's just an example. We're just one of many companies offering solar for homes. Why it's really compelling for people to install this on their roofs. But as for what's the potential? In Australia, 1 in every 5 homes now has a solar installation. And that is now accelerating because now almost every single solar installation in Australia is coming with storage. And solar and storage is already at parity with the grid in that country. So soon enough, there might be 1 in every 3 or 2. And with the Philippines having 22 million households, for us to forecast that there will be 1, 2, 3, or 4 million, so if it's a 20% penetration, 4 million households with solar rooftops in the Philippines within the next 5 years, would I think be a sound projection, which would equate to, let's say, 4 gigawatts of behind-the-meter residential rooftop installation. And with the potential in commercial being at least as big, there'd easily be over 5 gigawatts of behind-the-meter solar on the Philippine grid, such that rather than all these new plants serving increasing demand, electricity demand in the Philippines grid may well peak in the next few years. And on a final note, this may be a relatively small project, but it is the project that we are most proud of, because we believe that it is the truly disruptive solution to bringing cheap and reliable power to all unserved and underserved communities in the Philippines, and is a demonstration of the reliability of solar on grid as well. There's a town in Occidental Mindoro that is so remote that even the electric cooperative had deemed it unviable to serve in all its history. They approached us and asked us to set up a solar microgrid. We asked the DOE if there was any policy that would allow for this, being that we didn't have a franchise, and we were told to just go ahead, because we're now living in this age where anything that is good for the consumer, just from a pragmatic perspective, should really be encouraged. So we went ahead and did it. It's got 2 megawatts of solar, almost 2 megawatt hour battery installed. It's got diesel backup to ensure that even on rainy days and consecutive rainy days, power will not go out. So that this town that previously had NPC genset for only 16 hours on average per day is now having 24 hours, no brownout, for the first time in its history. And whereas NPC was previously being subsidized, their true cost of around 20 pesos, down to a subsidized rate of 6 pesos, but with other fees on top of that, meaning a delivered cost to customers of 12 pesos or more. We are currently delivering those customers a lower price than even the subsidized price. So we're delivering customers as low as 8 to 9 pesos per kilowatt hour, solar storage batteries and diesel in this town without a single peso of UCME, cheaper power than the Meralco franchise. And if this works in a small application without economies of scale, what more in the larger towns served by dysfunctional electric co-ops, where power rates are equally high, where outages are a fact of life, where none of us will need to spend on that universal charge for missionary electrification ever again. So that Meralco, I think, would be very happy that we won't need to shell out something like 25 centavos per kilowatt hour on our UCME subsidy. We can abolish NPC. We can abolish electric co-ops. We can just let people take power into their own hands and have distributed generation at a sub 10 peso solar storage diesel with the cost of distribution. And the Philippine grid will indeed have a decrease in total demand. So with that being said, we're very happy to answer questions and again invite anyone who's likewise passionate about advancing the development of the Philippine economy to join us in lowering power rates for all. Thank you.